Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm here with Dr. Cristine Legare. She is a professor of psychology and director of the Evolution, Variation, and Ontogeny of Learning Laboratory at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research examines how the human mind enables us to learn, create, and transmit culture. She conducts comparisons across age, culture, and species to address fundamental questions about cognitive and cultural evolution. So, Dr. Legare, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Okay, great. So, this is very interesting because I've already talked on the show with several guests about culture, particularly with anthropologists, right? But you try to tackle culture, I guess, and please correct me if I'm wrong, from two different perspectives. That is the phylogenetic one and the ontogenetic one. That is, you try to understand where culture comes from, its evolutionary history, and also how the tools, the cognitive tools that allow for a particular individual or species to have culture or to acquire culture, how they come online during development. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I think I'm trained as a cognitive scientist, and I'm interested in how culture is of the mind and for the mind. So the mind is prepared for culture, the human mind, that is. And I study children and how children acquire and construct culture because that provides insight into the sort of cultural foundations of, or the cognitive foundations of culture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so you refer to the human mind, but you also compare, you also do a little bit of comparative psychology, right? You compare us to other species. And
That's correct.
would you say, you specifically, that there are other species that also have culture or not?
Oh, I think there are many species that have culture. And I've done a bit of comparative psychological research, and I'm doing more of that. But there are many others who have established, I think, very compelling examples of culture in other species, including chimpanzees, of course, bonobos, and I mean, I think some of the most exciting evidence for culture actually comes from cetaceans, from killer whales. Excellent evidence for social transmission in those species. So it's really, I think it's a tremendously exciting time to study culture from a comparative perspective.
And is there an animal model that you focus more on, or that you would say is the best one for us to understand the evolutionary basis of culture, or not?
Well, my personal research has just been with chimpanzees and obviously Homo sapiens. Although we've started to do some research with dogs, which are fascinating from a social learning perspective. I would not name a best species for culture, other than, of course, humans. I think that humans are sort of uniquely and hypercultural. So every species is perfectly well suited for the particular ecologies and demands of their existence. And I think the more diversity we have in different models of animal culture, the better off we'll be in understanding what is uniquely human, what is not, how culture evolved. I think the proposal that humans are the only animal with culture is we've shown this is not the case, I think, pretty definitively, which doesn't mean that culture in humans isn't extraordinary and special, of course.
Yeah, particularly the fact that we have cumulative culture, that as far as we know, there isn't any other species that also has a cumulative culture, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Certainly not to the extent that we do. So if you think of cumulative culture as something that's really building upon the innovations and ideas of previous generations, this kind of ratchet effect that Tomasello has written about, and of course cumulative culture has been written about pretty extensively, as something that allows humans to capitalize on the insights and innovations of not just others in like living in the immediate present,
Yeah.
but many, many, many generations. And of course, we have really extraordinary cultural tools, cultural transmission systems like numeracy and literacy and the laptop that we're communicating, the laptops we're communicating through. All of these things are really, they're storage devices, storage and transmission devices.
So, since you're a cognitive psychologist, is there any set of cognitive tools or cognitive mechanisms that we know are essential for a particular species to have culture? Or is it the case that we don't have that kind of list of cognitive traits?
I would say that we've certainly identified capacities that make particular types of culture possible. So for example, one of the things that I've been doing a lot of research on recently is cognitive, we call it cognitive flexibility when we're applying it to humans. It's often referred to as behavioral flexibility when we think about it from a comparative perspective. And this allows the acquisition of a great variety of different tools, and also the ability to switch from a perhaps less efficient solution to a problem to a more efficient solution to a problem. And this is something that over the course of early childhood, this is linked to development of executive functioning and all sorts of maturation of the frontal cortex. But children become much more flexible in their ability to switch between rules, to update to more efficient solutions. This ability, of course, improves throughout childhood. Is the rate of change, I think, is perhaps especially notable in early childhood. And this is really essential for a species like ours, which is able to acquire a great variety of different toolkits. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about the most interesting thing about human culture is that we are born with the ability to acquire any language, any human language, language is plural, any toolkit, any body of knowledge within the human repertoire. And our cognitive system is sufficiently flexible to do this, which means that we're able to accommodate the enormous diversity that characterizes human cultures.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that human culture, particularly human culture, has an interesting aspect, because across societies we find cultural variation, but then since all human societies that we have studied have one form of culture or another, we can also say that culture is a human universal. So, is it the case that the evidence points toward all people in all society being equipped with the same underlying cognitive tools that give rise to culture, or not?
I think there's no question that is the case. So all of the cognitive foundations for acquiring, absolutely any cultural repertoire are present in all typically developing humans, human children. Their interest, not only are they equipped with the cognitive capacity to acquire cultural knowledge, beliefs, and languages and tools and things like this, they're also equipped with the motivation to want to do so. And I think that's something that I frequently marvel at, that young children are, even from infancy, are interested in other people. They're interested in this is what is driving their interest in acquiring culture. I mean, part of it is they want to learn the cool and interesting skills of those around them. But I think even more fundamentally, they want to be like those around them. They want to do what they do. They want to learn how to talk in the way that they do, to communicate in the way that they do. They're affiliative. And they're interested in affiliating with their kin, with the members of their group. So there's a social motivation to learn culture. Of course, culture is learned socially, that I think is very curiously human which is not to say other animals, of course, aren't interested in learning and things of that sort, but the social affiliative motivation for learning is, I think you have to take that into consideration when you study learning in general.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that one very important aspect here is that that kind of motivation is something innate, right? Children don't have to be taught to, I mean, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I think that there's an enormous amount of learning that happens in terms of what members of your family and your community value, the modality of interaction, whether there's a greater emphasis on, eye contact or kind of verbal transmission versus more of, kind of a physical transmission of information. So I think that when in terms of innate, there's massive flexibility in the ways in which information is transmitted, and even babies are very, very attentive to that. But the overall orientation to learn socially is definitely there from the get-go.
I get what you're saying. Yeah. So okay, so this might be a very complicated question, and I'm not sure if it's not an unfair one as well, but do you think that isolated human individuals would ever develop culture, or do you think that humans really need to live in a society, to be integrated in a particular society, to have some form of culture?
I think that the human mind is prepared for an environment with culture. We are born with the, expectation, if you want to call it that, for particular types of input. That would include language of some sort. That would include human interaction of some sort. We are we're an altricial group living primate species. So an isolated individual, would the kind of culture that they individually develop be massively impaired compared to what they would look like in a group? Of course. Would an individual human totally isolated from others, which would be a deeply deprivational state, right? That this individual would be impaired not just because they didn't have access to culture, but because they didn't have access to other humans, which humans need, right? This is something that they need on a cognitive, emotional, physical, social level. I do not think that an individual human in this kind of thought experiment would develop in the way that a chimpanzee would. I think the cognitive systems of, for example, ourselves and other closely related primates are in fact quite different. And would there be the sort of bedrock of culture there? Would there be sort of things that were cultural? I think so, albeit very impaired.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's very interesting because we've already mentioned the fact that there are some aspects associated with the cognitive tools behind culture that we could say are innate, like, for example, certain kinds of motivation. But even so, people need the right kinds of environmental inputs to develop culture properly, like, for example, to acquire language and so on. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, the input necessary to acquire the kinds of complex cultural toolkits characteristic of all human populations need to be there for this system to flourish. Certainly, we're born prepared and expecting that input, but yeah, that absolutely needs to be there. And we're, I think, very, very flexible in what we can acquire given different sorts of inputs. I was talking to a collaborator of mine from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he's working on acquiring his sixth language. I think if you talk to a lot of monolingual English-speaking Americans, they would find this just beyond their, it's really beyond their comprehension that you could be that hyperlingual. But that's probably much closer to the global norm, and to the norm of, hyper-linguistic proficiency over human evolutionary time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about human infants now. Is it the case that human infants go through several different stages of development where step by step they acquire the necessary cognitive tools that prepare them for culture, or how does it happen exactly?
I wouldn't characterize it as a step-like process. The field of cognitive development was shaped by the this Piagetian model of different stages or steps of development, and Piaget had enormous number of really brilliant insights about child development. But the stage-like model has been updated in the decades since that was proposed. There are, absolutely. Lots of empirical evidence for the learning processes that take place over the course of early and middle and late childhood. The process of language acquisition, for example, and how, I think a lot of the big progress in the development of how children learn has been in how all of these different kinds of learning work together to build complex bodies of knowledge. So language is, for communication. It allows us to participate in the learning process, to actively to ask questions, to be proactive in the kind of information that we learn from those around us. So language is occurring in the context of social interaction and social learning. At the same time, the brain is developing. Executive functioning is getting faster and better. Children are better able to solve problems. Their working memory improves over the course of development. So all of these cognitive systems are working in tandem, in parallel together to increase the sophistication of children's learning, cultural information and skills and toolkits.
Mm-hmm. So just to set the stage for us to talk about scientific reasoning and scientific thinking, because it differs quite a lot from our intuitive thinking, I guess, and it's in some ways, yeah. So with Dr. David C. Geary, that I talked with him on the show 2 years ago or so. We mentioned the literature on what people call core knowledge, right? Folk physics, folk biology, folk psychology, things like that. Do you know if this is a human universal? If the components of what we call core knowledge are the same across cultures, or if they differ in some way?
I think I think that's an empirical question. We don't have nearly as much data on that as would be ideal, and I think that's a topic that is being increasingly more widely studied. So there's good news on that front. The data that currently exists is that the sort of core fundamentals for thinking about interacting with other humans, like folk psychology, or interacting with objects in the environment in folk physics, and interacting with the natural world for folk biology, are, I think, without question, universal at their core. I think, though, that the amount of specificity for what that core knowledge would look like is, we're learning a lot more about that. And to keep in mind, I was thinking about this recently in a conversation with a colleague. Folk biology in particular is fascinating, in that humans everywhere interact with the natural world, plants and animals. We know that young children everywhere are very curious about these sorts of things. But there's enormous cultural variation in how much direct interaction young children have with the natural world, and there are, I think there are large gaps in our understanding of the particular sort of preparedness that exists there, and what it's and how these massively different culturally constructed environments are impacting what children are learning about the natural world. Right? I interacted with an 8-year-old fairly recently who discovered for the first time that the chicken nuggets that she enjoyed eating were in fact made of chicken flesh and chicken meat, which is extraordinary that we have large populations of people on the planet, children, even adults, who have extremely little knowledge of where their food comes from. Right? This is a historically relatively recent characteristic of many industrialized environments. So all the more reason, that's a great reason for cross-cultural, the critical scientific need for cross-cultural research. You can't possibly specify something like core knowledge by studying only one population.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So let me ask you this. This is maybe a complicated question. Let me see if I can articulate it properly. So do you think that the sort of variation at the level of core knowledge that we get across cultures would occur at the level of the, let's say, explicit knowledge that people develop about, for example, how the world works, how the biological world works, how the mind of other people work, and so on and so forth? Or that it varies also, or it may also vary at the level of the underlying subconscious cognitive mechanisms that give rise to it?
I suppose the way I've studied these topics and the data that we've collected would indicate, I guess, option A. So for example, are all humans prepared to think about the minds of others and to speculate about the content of the minds of other people? I think the data that we have indicate absolutely yes. It would be, in fact, very difficult to imagine how you could come to speculate about the content of other minds if you had no preparation for this whatsoever cognitively. If there was no kind of curiosity about the minds of others, if there was none of the kind of cognitive architecture to simulate the ideas of others, learning this in some entirely unprepared way, I think, would be a challenge. Of course, that doesn't mean that we know in great detail how much is prepared. It's also true that people in different populations think about minds in really fantastically different ways. So one example of this, I've done some collaborative research with a psychological anthropologist at Stanford. Her name is Tanya Luhrmann. And one of the things that we have studied is kind of mental models of mind and cultural variation in this. So one of the things she's written about is she and others, in fact, the boundedness of the Western mind, or beliefs about the mind is bounded. So the mind exists in the skull, in the brain, and if you want to transmit the content of your mind to others, you have to explicitly communicate this in some way, thus the kind of bounded aspect of it. It turns out other populations have different ideas about how accessible or not the mental content of minds are, and have a variety of different ideas about different ways in which mental content, thought, cognition can be transmitted. So specifying that there is some preparation to think about human minds as special really doesn't tell us much about how, or doesn't explain that, at least in and of itself, doesn't explain the extraordinary variety about how different people think minds work. And from my perspective, that is the most interesting thing about the variation, is what's most interesting about, about the human mind and human culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let me ask you now about a very specific cognitive mechanism, causal learning in children specifically. So how does it work in children? How do children think about causes and effects and things like that, and how does it compare with how we do it in science, let's say?
So children are very interested in cause and effect, very much like a scientist would be. So the kinds of curiosities they have, I think, are similar. Young children are interested in figuring out how the world works. They have a vested interest in that, as we all do, and scientists are curious about the same sorts of things. The depth of their understanding of mechanism vary. So, children understand about cause and effect is going to be really different than the depth of knowledge of a scientist. Also, the process by which you learn about causality from an intuitive causal perspective is quite different than the kind of formal scientific process. It's not that there aren't any similarities there, but the truth is formal science, rigorously following the scientific method, is a challenge for most scientists. So, it does require formal training, extensive formal training, as you know. So there are, I think, provocative and useful, informative, I should say, parallels between the kind of intuitive scientific process and the formal scientific process. But I think there are very important differences, and it's true that designing a diagnostic experiment, this is not something that children are good at. This is something that most adults and often many scientists aren't good at. So it's not that young children are, in a literal sense, using the formal scientific process. They might use aspects of it. And they're definitely very curious about cause and effect relations, are in a very precocious way. And this is true based on all of the cross-cultural data that we have as well. I mean, the physical systems that they're interacting with are going to be a bit different, but curiosity to figure out, what makes what work is universal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of that concept that David Sigiri also uses. I can't remember the name exactly, but I think that he talks about primary cognitive capacities or something like that, and then the secondary ones that are the ones that build on the primary ones. So, for example, we have folk physics and folk biology, but then that's very different from biology and physics, the science, and we really have to go through school and through an effortful learning of those kinds of things. We have to go through a huge volume of knowledge to really become scientists themselves, let's say. So that's another thing that we have to take into account, right? That the kinds of things that we are able to acquire as knowledge just by ourselves and by following our intuitive systems, let's say, wouldn't take us that far. Right?
No, definitely not. It's one of the reasons that I'm interested in studying scientific learning and reasoning. It's a wonderful way to study culture. So the content, we're certainly prepared to be curious about the natural world. We are reliant on the natural world. We're reliant on interacting with humans to successfully navigate our lives. Mm-hmm. And we are an artifact using and loving primate species. So it's not at all surprising to me that we're prepared to think about this kind of this particular kind of content, but what populates these you want to call them domain-specific theories requires a lot of learning and knowledge.
What about imitation? Isn't that also a very important aspect or mechanism that children use to acquire, in this case, culture and then also scientific knowledge?
Yeah, children use imitation to acquire all kinds of knowledge and skills. They use imitation to acquire what I call instrumental skills, like using tools. They also use imitation to acquire the social conventions, the rituals, all of the social practices that are really critical to successfully navigate life within social groups. So children use imitation for all of, in language. It's a very, very efficient way to learn through a social process. And I mean, one really interesting thing about imitation is how cognitively demanding it is. It takes a lot of mental effort to remember and to represent and to simulate and to reproduce the behavior of others. So it's a very efficient means of social learning, but it's actually a very complex process that humans are exceptionally good at and skilled at from a very, very young age. Basically, as early as you can study this, you're starting to see imitative behavior, the foundations of imitative behavior that I think are, really, it's essential to understand imitation, understand cultural learning. This is human cultural learning would not be possible in the ways that we currently experience it without imitation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So another thing now, so I think, and again, pitting our intuitive systems for knowledge acquisition against scientific reasoning and the scientific method, I guess that we could say that many times it's easier for people to develop some sort of supernatural explanation for whatever phenomena they find out there. But then we have the scientific method that is materialistic and the naturalistic approach. And sometimes people have at the same time the two kinds of knowledge. I mean, the two kinds of knowledge coexist in them, the naturalistic one and the super naturalistic one. So that happens, right? It isn't the case that, for example, one has to supervene on the other or something like that, or one trumps the other, right?
Right. So the way I think about explanation is that people are looking for both how and answers to both how and why questions. So we're always looking for explanations or often I would say, looking for explanations at multiple different levels of causality. And this means that we bring multiple explanatory systems to bear on particular events and outcomes and things that we want to understand in our daily lives. So this could be bringing a scientific explanation and a religious explanation. This could be a scientific explanation and a kind of intuitive or folk scientific belief. So it's not just that the natural and supernatural coexist, although this is especially likely to be a kind of a salient distinction in populations that have knowledge of the formal scientific method in addition to religious belief systems. So the content of what coexists in different populations, it varies a little bit, and certain types of explanatory systems I think are more satisfying for particular types of questions than others. So for example, when one experiences chronic illness, which is a unfortunate fact of the human condition and something that all human populations have to grapple with, and all individual humans have to grapple with at some point in their lives, you can explain something like a chronic illness with a scientific, a folk biological, a religious, a supernatural. All of those sorts of explanations can be used to interpret it. And people often do this at different levels of causality. So what I mean by that is, if you experienced a chronic illness like cancer, you'd use the biological explanation for cancer to explain the proximate process of how cancer works within the body and how it's working within your body. That sort of explanation doesn't provide an answer to what is also a very fundamentally human question, which is, right, but why is this happening to me personally? Why is this happening to me at this point in my life? And this is where people start often, not always, but often recruiting religious or supernatural explanations, like what did I do to bring this upon myself? What did I do to deserve this? What is the universe trying to teach me through this experience? These are very common human questions. I think they're universal, and science is often very unsatisfactory when it's unfortunately you have a particular gene mutation that puts you at predisposes you to develop this type of cancer, is perhaps not as satisfying as a lot of people would like.
Yeah, I guess that science doesn't give you rosy narratives of the universe, let's say.
Well, I mean, maybe not in all circumstances, right? Yeah. And I think it gives fabulously rosy narratives in some ways, but from a kind of personal meaning, purpose perspective, I think it's perhaps not quite as satisfying in some cases than religion and kind of supernatural explanations provide.
Yeah, certainly not. So, okay, so talking about folk psychology a little bit now, there's this aspect of it where people have a component that is called essentialism, that is, they attribute an essence, in this case, to themselves and to other people. And we can also connect that with folk biology, I guess, because they also do that with other animals and even plant species, I guess. And isn't that one of the things that renders it difficult for people to accept the evidence for evolution, I mean, for natural selection, and for them to think about it properly and to use it and apply it and so on?
So I think that's the obstacles for accepting evolution or not are a little different than the kind of cognitive processes, the cognitive biases that make understanding evolution difficult. And I'll explain why I think it's important to make that distinction. Even among people who accept evolution as true, and I'm being very careful with my words there, many of those people don't necessarily understand the evolutionary process very accurately. To be fair, evolution is very difficult to understand, and it also violates many of the cognitive biases that humans use to very effectively navigate the world around them. So we have cognitive biases because on average, they're very useful. They get us to the right place and the right answer most of the time. Not always, though, right? And there are particular contexts in which cognitive biases impede understanding. So, evolution would be one example there. So essentialism does make change over time, and the ways in which new species emerge is an obstacle to understanding this. But it's not just essentialism. Our bias to think teleologically is another obstacle that a number of scholars, Deb Kellerman, for example, has written about quite extensively, that thinking about the world in terms of function and purpose, that's a very useful bias in navigating most of human life. Humans are intentional. They are goal-directed. So that's really useful for understanding the behavior of other humans. That's less useful for understanding something like natural selection and evolution, which is there's not a designer, there's not a creator, it's not purposeful and goal-directed in that particular way. So those are just two examples of biases which make understanding evolution more difficult, even if you fully accepted this is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe dualism, I mean mind-brain or mind-body dualism would be another one, right? But particularly when it comes to people really accepting things like evolutionary psychology and the fact that our brains have also been shaped by evolution.
Yeah, I think in the context of objections to something like evolutionary psychology, that's also multiply determined. And there are, I guess, multiple different sources of perhaps objection, in some cases misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons why I think studying studying something like evolution is so fascinating. It's really an equal opportunity offender, right? You can have, sort of religious objections and ideological objections. You can also have, misunderstandings of how evolution works. Also, there are misapplications of evolutionary theory to human behavior and human cognition. I mean, the field is very much in its infancy and is growing and changing in lots of different ways. So it's fascinating to study this because there are so many different ways in which objections can emerge.
Yeah, sure. I know, because I've been having quite a lot of evolutionary psychologists on the show, so I'm well aware of that.
Yeah.
So, and now trying to link all of this with scientific reasoning. How do children develop scientific reasoning? I'm asking you this because I read some papers of yours, for example, one where you mention the fact that young children revise explanations in response to new evidence, and that is one of the traits that a scientist needs to have, right? I mean, revising explanations if the evidence goes against the knowledge that they had or something like that, right?
Right. So children are actively working on understanding their environment, and they do this through active exploration. So young children are kind of characteristically interested in exploring the world around them. They're also in active collaboration with others. So they're asking questions, they're receiving explanations, they're generating their own explanations. And one of the things I've written about is how the process of exploration and explanation work together to generate new forms of understanding. So explanation, if you want to think about this in a very in a loose way, is about generating a potential hypothesis that then can be tested out through the process of exploration. Also tested out by conversing with others, asking questions, getting more information. And then new hypotheses can be formulated. We know that young children are very attentive and interested when inconsistencies with their prior knowledge come up, when they're faced with anomaly, with surprising outcomes, so with outcomes that violate their expectations. And all of these sorts of curiosities are very useful for identifying gaps in knowledge, inaccurate beliefs, and then all of these processes of explanation and exploration are the kind of engine for revising those beliefs. It's also very possible and very common for people to entertain all kinds of information that is partially processed, hasn't been thoroughly examined. So it's all of our minds are full of bits of partially digested, inconsistent information. And it often requires a specific occasion to sit down and identify the sources of inconsistency and realize, oh, I believe this and I believe this, and these are not in fact consistent with each other, and I need to reason through this. This is a sort of thing that interacting with others, that education does for children. It provides a more formalized process for belief revision and knowledge acquisition.
Mm-hmm. And it also probably allows children and adults to systematize their knowledge a little bit more, because, as you said, maybe sometimes people even have conflicting epistemologies about the same issues, right?
Absolutely. That's true for all of us all the time. And it's certainly not the case that just providing people with more information automatically leads to updating of inaccurate beliefs, the revision of inaccurate beliefs. Often the process of identifying inconsistency needs to be quite explicit. It's not even the case that people always identify that information is inconsistent. You often need to point this out to children, to students, to learners more generally, and give them an opportunity to work through it. Conceptual change is a hard process. And that's a core part of what learning entails, but it does require and benefit from explicit education. This is why we have education, is for exactly for this purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the reasons that we also mentioned before, having to do with the fact that by ourselves we surely wouldn't be able to acquire this kind of knowledge and things like that. Okay, so I should have asked you this before, but again, talking about evolution, because as we said, this is there are several different factors behind why people don't accept evolution easily and why they aren't able to think correctly through an evolutionary lens, let's say. But there's another thing here that we can talk about, that is the use of anthropomorphic language and how it might influence how children particularly think about evolutionary concepts, because I mean sometimes it's useful to use anthropomorphic terms to render it easier to tell people how things work and stuff like that, but it might also backfire a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, it's a great example of another cognitive bias. We are humans and we have human brains that are prepared to communicate with other humans. So the cognitive biases that we have are very useful for interpreting human behavior. They are less useful in interpreting the behavior of other species, for example. And the kind of language that characterizes kind of anthropomorphism, this which is related to teleological reasoning, also thinking about wanting and needing and desiring, those are really useful if you want to understand the behavior of another human. They're markedly less useful. In fact, they are actively they actively compromise our understanding of natural processes that are not based on a human agent whatsoever. But we find language like that very accessible. It's why you listen to wildlife biology documentaries, and you'll have narrators who certainly understand that cacti are not making explicit decisions about which side of the mountain that they are going to be growing on. We'll still use language like that because it makes narrative accessible. So it's a difficult thing. I've actually struggled with this a bit in developing more accurate narratives about how to teach evolution, which is something I'm interested in doing, because removing all of that language it impairs comprehension of the overall narrative structure, because this sort of language is such a deep part of how we tell stories and how we communicate information. So it's a fine balance there. Using, for example, goal-directed, desire-based, agent-based language is overtly inaccurate. But removing all of it, including things that are, need-based, for example, can make understanding or comprehending narrative difficult. So I think there's a fine balance that the human mind is the sort of target that you're trying to influence. So you want to present information that is accessible to a human mind, but also not presenting information that's going to reconfirm the kinds of cognitive biases that we know we already have.
Yeah, and that's probably a very difficult thing to do. Right.
It is a difficult task, and I think it's something that tailoring content to learners of different ages and different amounts of expertise is really important. So we shouldn't teach biology to novices in exactly the same way we should teach biology to experts. But that said, the premise, the basis for biology is evolutionary theory. And one of the huge problems with biological education in the US is that in many regions, in many places, biology is taught, certainly at the elementary school, high school level, in a very atheoretical way, and without the evolutionary process. So I think it's certainly the case that the sooner evolutionary theory is introduced to children, the better. And this is something children are very curious about. You're building on their natural curiosity. So rather than start with biology as a kind of disconnected set of facts with no underlying purpose or connection, like memorizing the parts of a flower, you can do that, but without an understanding of where life comes from, what life is equipped to do, how it changes, you're missing the point. So it's the content should be tailored to different ages and different experience levels and different knowledge levels, but there's no age too young for evolutionary theory. I think the sooner the better.
Well, that's good news, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just ask you one last question. After all of this, after all that we've talked about, do you think that we can say that in a way or another children are proto-scientists in their cognition and thinking, or do you think that that's too much to say?
I think that's why the field, many in the field use the term naive scientists. I feel comfortable thinking about children as naive scientists. They have, as I say, a lot of the same curiosities that a scientist would. They use a process of knowledge acquisition, which is in some ways similar to what scientists do. Is it literally the same? Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. As we've discussed, formal scientific work, reasoning, is effortful and difficult, and in many ways counterintuitive to how the mind works. One simple example of this is we find designing experiments that would disconfirm a hypothesis much more difficult than designing an experiment that will provide confirmatory information for what we already think.
Sure.
So that's just one example of what we need formal scientific training to do for us.
Yeah. Okay, so can we call children then naive scientists? Is that the case, or?
I think we can call them, as long as we can call them naive scientists, as long as we don't get too carried away with how formal we think that scientific process is. But I do think that it's the case that human minds are social learning systems, that the business of childhood is acquiring all the skills and knowledge and toolkits of the populations that they're part of, and they're actively constructing and acquiring information. Scientists do not, right? The business of learning is shared by children and scientists.
Okay. So let's end on that positive and interesting note, Dr. Legare. And before we go, where are the places on the internet where people can find your work if they want?
My website, so CristineLegare.com. My papers are up there. We're working on a number of different broad topics. We're doing a lot of what I'm calling applied cognitive science research. So we work in the domain of international education and global public health, as well as science education. So harnessing all of the insights that we have about how children learn to become members of diverse communities to improve things like science education, to improve education around the world, and to improve public health outcomes. So those are the topics that I'm working on currently.
Okay, great. That's good to know, and I will leave links to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting. And Dr. Legare, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a pleasure to everyone, and I really loved the conversation. So
thank you. It was really wonderful to talk with you.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've been doing a lot of interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and now I really need your help to keep the channel sustainable and to have it in the long run. So I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And if you prefer, you also have links to monthly subscriptions on PayPal, or a link also to make a one-time big donation or several times big donations on PayPal as well. All of the links are in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, PayPal supporters, the main ones, of course, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, and Dan Demetriou, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark. My producers is Webb, Rosie, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Eleolin Osborne, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, and Luis Caetano. And my executive producer, Michal Rugieski. Thank you for all.